For those of you who don't know me, my name's Dr. Singer. Thank you guys for being here tonight. So today, what are we talking about? We're talking about lower extremity health, how we can keep our feet, our knees, our lower extremities healthy for our whole life, right? That's a fairly good goal, I think. All right, so let's get started. So let's just define a few of the problems that come up in the lower extremities first. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about and what we're going to be addressing and how to fix them, right? So we're going to go over some of them, right? So IT band syndrome, pretty much just there's a muscle that goes, and we're going to show you some of the actual anatomy in a little bit, but I just want to bring up what the problems are, right? So IT band syndrome, pretty much there's this band that goes from here and inserts right here on the lateral aspect of the knee, okay? So what happens is, we're going to talk about it, but it's pretty much a tightening of that band leading to friction and inflammation in that area there. So usually if you feel like tension here, now a lot of people will feel knee pain a lot of times, and this is one of the main causes of it, right? And we'll talk about why that happens a little later. Knee osteoarthritis, okay? So some of you might be familiar with that term, but we're going to be going over a little bit later. But pretty much degeneration in the joints of the knees, and we're going to talk about how the knee is actually living tissue and how, you know, if we catch it early enough, knee osteoarthritis can be reversed, which is pretty cool, right? Because most doctors don't think in the terms of that, but what I specialize here is joint regeneration, okay? That's what we really focus on in our office, okay? Plantar fasciitis, inflammation of the plantar fascia tendon. We're gonna go over what that, like a little bit more of why that happens, where it goes, but pretty much there's a fascial tendon on the bottom of your foot, and if it gets inflamed or overstretched, if it gets overstretched, it becomes inflamed, okay? We'll talk about all the fun ways to actually fix that. Bunions. So this is where we're looking at things like bony overgrowths on the sides of the feet, different parts of the feet, how they happen, and what I'm going to talk about later on is how a lot of these things are symptoms of the same kind of problems. There's only a select set of things or dysfunctions in the lower extremities that happen that actually lead to all of these problems, okay? So when we're talking about how to fix all of these things, a lot of it is going to be addressed the same way, which is going to be kind of interesting, but once I explain that, it'll make sense to you, okay? Hammer toes, another issue that can happen where actually like the foot starts to come up. I'll show you all these pictures later. Shin splints, so splinting of the anterior or posterior aspect of what's called this tibialis muscle. Athlete's foot, we're going to talk about that one too, or fungus in the feet, as well as ligamentous knee tears. Okay, so there's a bunch of different ligaments that surround the knee itself, how they tear and how they're predisposed to tear. So we're going to go into some of those, okay? But just a little bit of statistics on these things. So who's actually affected by these problems? And I didn't go through every single one of those issues, but just to get a general idea of it, half the population in America will have knee osteoarthritis. I mean, right there, that's a pretty substantial amount of the population that are dealing with issues like this. Half the population. 1% of the population has plantar fasciitis. 23 to 36% of the population have bunions, right? And again, a lot of these are symptoms of the same kinds of problems. 60 million Americans have hammer toe, right? So this is, I mean, lower extremity problems affect, we'll call it more than half the population of people, right? So we got to understand what's normal first, okay? So we're going to go into some of what's normal, right? So we talked about what the problems are, right? Now we can talk about what's actually normal, and then we can fix it, right? So this is a picture right here of the human skeleton, right? Isn't that thing awesome? I deal with this all day, the human frame. I think it's pretty amazing. So pretty much there's things that we want to have happen inside of the human frame so that when they're aligned properly, the body is going to function properly, okay? So one of the big things I'm going to have you pay attention to is the hips here, right? So generally speaking, if you're from the front to back right here, the hips should be level, okay? One hip shouldn't be higher than the other one. Does that make sense? Because if one hip's higher than the other one, you can start to see some dysfunctions that start to happen, okay? So when we're looking at this, I'm going to show you what happens to the muscles in these areas, right? And what happens to the loads on the lower extremity, as well as the loads onto the feet, okay? So what we're going to talk about, before we even get into that, there's also these things called subluxations in the lower back, okay? When we talk about the nervous system, we talk about what its effect is that goes into the legs, right? So if there are nerves that are supposed to control your extremities, if those nerves aren't firing properly, do you think there will be problems in the legs?
Most likely.
Most likely, right? So it's, I always give the analogy of like a watering hose, right? So if we're trying to water our garden over here and somebody steps on the garden, what happens to the garden? Or somebody steps on the hose, what happens to the garden over time? It dies, right? It doesn't get the proper information, doesn't get the proper nutrients, right? So if we're talking about nerves that are supposed to be coming out of the lower back and into the legs, the nerves are what supply the muscle tones from the front and the back and all the different muscles, right? Because muscles don't act by themselves, correct? If you have a piece of steak sitting there, is it going to contract on itself? That if it's detached from the body? No. What's going to make it move? Nerve supply, right? So there has to be an actual active nerve supply to the muscles which make it function, correct? So if we're talking about how the muscles and all these things interact in our legs, if we don't have the proper nerve flow going into those areas, we could have problems, okay? And we're gonna go even more in depth in that a little bit later. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Now, here is a normal function, here's a normal knee, okay? Couple things that we're looking out for in the knee. So this would be a front to back picture of the knee, right? So you have this big guy here, it's called the patella or the kneecap, right? So it sits on the front. We have muscles that come in from the lateral aspects, right? So the lateral aspects and the medial aspects of the muscles. These big muscles called the quadriceps come in from the front, right? And then you have this big bone on the bottom, it's called your tibia. And on the outside aspects of both of your knees, you have these bones called the fibula, okay? Now the fibula can move out of alignment as well as every one of these bones can actually move out of alignment inside of the knee themselves, okay? When we're looking at this guy, the fibula, it can go, well, one of two ways. It can go forward or backwards, okay? As far as subluxations. It also has a joint, it also acts when you take a step, moving up and down with your feet, that bone actually slides up and down, okay? So this is something that you gotta pay attention to. The tibia here, when it moves, it actually glides and pivots at the same time. So a lot of times, area here as far as the tibia, is when it gets out of alignment, it generally tends to move inward, okay? So when I do adjustments on this area, so obviously if you have a tibia here and it's rotated inward, and you go to take a step, do you think that will cause problems on the knee? Yeah. Of course, right? So one of the things that we do is, as chiropractors, is we also adjust, right, and we put it back into its normal alignment with actual adjustments. Now, we don't want to continually have to do that adjustment, so we're going to have to give exercises and things like that and find out why that's happening. Does this make sense? We're getting a bigger picture as we go along here, so bear with it. So we also have these things called the ligaments, right? So the lateral aspect, the medial aspect, and then we have these things called your meniscus, okay? A lot of times when people get like a blowout injury, like during like football or things like that, where they get somebody comes and tackles somebody from the lateral aspect, this whole area will shift over and you'll get like parts of the insides like actually blow out, right? Mm-hmm. So the medial collateral ligament, so the medial meniscus, things like that will all get injured at that point. Now that's more of like a acute injury like when playing sports, but that also can happen over time if we talked about the hip alignment, right? So if your hip is sitting up high on one side, what's going to happen is this whole femur that we're talking about here can actually shift internally and will put more pressure on the inside aspect of the knee, okay? Does this make sense? So over time, what ends up happening is that guy can actually, over time, start to loosen up and start to move out of its normal alignment. Does that make sense? And it can be more prone to tears at that point. And we don't like that. Nobody likes those tears, right? That make sense? Okay. So that's all the normal stuff. We're going to go into some of a little more of the problems a little bit later. Here's your foot. Foot's an amazing thing, right? So it's got 26 bones in it, 33 joints, 100 different tendons, muscles, and ligaments all inside of it, right? I think it's a pretty amazing piece of machinery that we have here, right? So, and there are 3 arches that are supposed to actually be inside of the foot themselves, right? So we have the anterior transverse arch, the one that goes across the front of it. And then we have the 2 lateral, so they have the medial and the lateral longitudinals, the ones that go on the outsides, okay? So when we look at the arch, it has to have a couple things present in it. It has to both be strong, right? But it also has to be flexible at the same time. So if you think about it, right, have you guys ever seen like pictures of people or seen anybody kick through a concrete block or something like that, or a wood block? You guys seen this, right? Yeah. So that's pretty strong, right? It has to be very strong, but it also has to be flexible to be able to move and to move around. Does that make sense? So what ends up happening, I'm gonna kind of go through this. So this is a lateral aspect of your leg, right? I'm gonna show you your hip here, because you could have problems in the feet that stem even from the hips, like we were talking about earlier, right? So let's say that one of those hips had gone up like this. You see how all of these muscles are all connected, right? So there's all the muscles, but all the muscles are attached to these things called fascia, okay? And fascia, pretty much what that means is it's all of the connective tissue that connects all of the body, and it goes all throughout the body. There's these big fascial planes. What happens is if this hip moves forward like this, all of this fascia starts to pull up. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Now that fascia, the very end of it goes on the bottom of the foot here, okay? Right by this thing called a calcaneus, okay? So this big muscle on the back of your foot, or the back of your heel. So what ends up happening is if this is anterior like that, all of these muscles are pulling harder. That's gonna start to pull on the bottom of the foot, and then you see this fascial sheath here? It will start to stretch out even further. Does this make sense? If it stretches out even further, what do you think is going to happen to this guy? We'll think there'll be a little bit of inflammation on the bottom of the foot. Yeah, exactly, right? So if it's overstretched, it's going to create inflammation. So inflammation, in terms of like the Latin root word, they give it itis. You guys heard this? Uh-huh. Right? So itis means inflammation, right? So you'll have inflammation of the bottom of the foot, or this is the plantar surface, called plantar fasciitis, right? Have you guys heard this? Yes. So can a problem in the foot come from a problem in the hips? Yes. Absolutely, right? So problem is, so we're going to go a little bit more into like the traditional approaches for dealing with like plantar fasciitis and stuff like this. I've seen like surgeries that people do for like where they actually will go onto the bottom and they'll actually sever that tendon. This is the actual treatment for this, guys. I watched it the other day. They'll sever the tendon there to loosen it up. Ouch. Right? Does that seem like and so here's the problem. They're just looking at the foot and they're not looking at its correlation with the rest of the body. Does this make sense? So that would not be what's called a solution, right? That would be called like a very temporary fix, and not a good one at that, because what ends up happening is now you get more fascial adhesions and stuff like that, and then it's going to heal out of its normal position that it's supposed to be in. Make sense? Mm-hmm. So not a good idea. Okay, so that's all I wanted to really show you with this guy here. Okay, now we're going to talk about the arches a little bit later. Now I'm going to go into the next slide. So I'm going to go over why a lot more of these problems happen. But generally, if we look at the body as just a total unit and a collection of cells, we're going to focus less on the cells today and more just on the biomechanics of the body, okay? So think there are 3 types of stresses that can negatively affect the body, okay? And for those of you that have been in my class, you'll know about them. There's physical stresses that can happen, there's chemical stresses that can happen, and then there's emotional stresses. When we're talking mechanics and stuff like that, we're going to focus primarily on the physical and the chemical effects of how it affects it, okay? Those stresses. Does that make sense? So we're going to go into some of those now, right? So we talked about physical stresses, chemical stresses or toxins, and then we got emotional stress or thoughts. We're not going to be talking about those tonight, but it could affect it, but we're going to focus on the primary ones that affect the lower extremities tonight, okay? water break before I move on. So, I already gave you some of the physical stresses that can happen inside of the body, right? So we're talking about traumas or physical stresses. We're gonna go over some of these things, okay? So overweight, physical inactivity, misalignment of the spine and hips, we talked about some of these, or improper footwear. So we're gonna go over all of those, okay? So we'll start with overweight, okay? So here's a statistic. Every one, and this is from, I think, Mayo Clinic, every 1 pound of excess weight, so that means like if you're like whatever your normal BMI is supposed to be, let's say, you know, if your BMI is supposed to be normal, if it's over it, for every pound over that, 1 pound of excess weight puts 4 pounds of pressure on joints of the weight-bearing joints, okay? So that means things like your spine, your hips, your knees, and your feet. Does that all make sense? So if you're, you know, let's say 20 pounds overweight, 20 times 4, 80 more pounds of pressure on those weight-bearing joints, okay? So that, again, your spine, your knees, your hips, your feet, okay? And so over time, excess pressure, just general force load on it with gravity, what do you think is going to happen to those joints?
Ouch.
They can start to wear down. Does this make sense? So yes, making sure you're of a proper weight. We're going to go over some of the, like some food tips a little bit later. Making sure you're in proper weight will be obviously on the solutions list, right? Physical inactivity, okay? So here's an interesting fact. When you swing a golf club, people that go golfing, it puts like 7 to 8 times more pressure into the lower part of the back. So the nerves that go into the legs particularly, okay? Now when you're sitting, it puts 5 times more pressure on the joints that go into that lower. So isn't that interesting? So golf swing 8 times, sitting 5 times, okay? So that's obviously, so what do you think, right? So if you're overweight and if you're sitting, because overweight, sitting leads to overweight, right? So if you're overweight, you're putting more pressure on the lower extremity, on the lower back, which is where the nerves come out into the lower extremities, as well as being overweight, right? So sitting, not walking on uneven surfaces. Now here's another problem, okay? When we're going to talk a little bit more about the feet and how they actually develop arches. When you're a baby, you're born and you pretty much have flat feet. You guys know this? So that's everybody has that. How do you develop them? Through use, right? So you start moving around. You start walking on surfaces and sand and dirt and everything and get your feet on, right? Over time, the little muscles that we showed you guys earlier that are inside of they're called intrinsic muscles. The muscles that are actually inside of the foot itself will actually start to develop, okay? So as they do that, it actually will build the arch actually into the foot, okay? Same thing with I'll give you another example in the neck, right? So when you're born, you do not have what's called a lordotic curve in your neck. It's actually going, because when you're born kind of like this, right? So you have this, it's going the other way. Now, as you start to crawl and start looking up at mommy and daddy, you start to develop a proper curve into your neck. This is how you develop these things. So that's what happens in the feet, right? So you start to use it, and your feet actually start to develop the proper curve, arches in them, okay? So what happens is, again, physical inactivity. So we're talking about surfaces, okay? So your average surface that most people walk on, are they uneven? No, they're not. We're mostly walking on floors, or outside we're walking on concrete, carpeting, right? These are the surfaces that we generally come in contact with. So guess what? Are we really using our feet the way that they're designed to be used? Absolutely not, right? So that's called not using your feet properly, okay? So we start to use our feet properly, that's how we're gonna start to redevelop the arches that are supposed to be naturally in our feet. So we're gonna go over some of those exercises that you can do, but if you just think about it, walking on dirt, so uneven surfaces, dirt, grass, sand, things like that, will actually start to strengthen. Any of you guys walk on sand before?
Most shoes don't have an arch in them anymore.
Yeah, we'll talk more about arches and stuff in shoe support a little bit later. But if you're talking about just going and walking barefoot in the sand, What do you feel like afterwards? Do your feet feel, sometimes they'll feel sore, right?
Yeah,
why do they feel sore? Because we don't use those muscles.
Yeah.
Does this make sense?
Yeah.
So part of developing the arches is actually getting back out and using our feet like they're designed to be used. Make sense? Okay. Very good. So I went over all that. Very good. Now, lack of blood flow. Oh yeah, perfect. Here we go. So also when we're looking at the joints, particularly like, let's talk about the knees for a second, right? So there's supposed to be blood flowing into the actual knee itself, and it gets that. Most of the blood supply from it is from movement, okay? So when you take a step, when you flex and dorsiflex your foot right here, what ends up happening is there's this pump on the backside surface of your leg, okay? And when you actually move like this, that pump will shoot blood back up and into the knee, and it'll help to rehydrate the knee in the spaces between the bones. Also, when you walk, okay, every time you take a step, what that does is it creates a pressure inside of the knee, and it actually draws blood into the joint tissue itself, okay? So again, when we're talking about physical inactivity, if we're not moving our extremities regularly, like, walking. Somebody told me earlier they started a walking program. I'm like, great, that's a great thing to do. You're actually going to be driving blood into those tissues to be able to regenerate cartilage. Cool? I think it's pretty cool. All right. We talked about overweight, physical inactivity, sitting, misalignment of the spine and the hips. Okay, so we talked about that. Now, one thing I didn't talk about was the IT band syndrome. So when we talked about the hips, I'm going to give you a view of it real quick. So we talked about the hips. We'll just go back to it. If you have a hip that's misaligned, there's this muscle that goes from here, from the sacrum, and it extends over here. So what ends up happening is it's supposed to be, let's say it's just supposed to be like this long, the muscle, right? What ends up happening is if one of the hips shifts forward, that muscle will start to elongate. And over time, what do you think will happen to it? It's going to become inflamed, right? So it becomes inflamed. That's what creates this thing called piriformis syndrome. Have you heard of this? So there's this thing called piriformis syndrome. But pretty much, if the muscle's overextended, it'll actually put pressure on that thing. And then here's the other part of it. Underneath that muscle, there's the nerve that comes out of it called the sciatic nerve, right? So if that so you have the hip misaligned, you have a piriformis that's sitting underneath it, and then you have the sciatic nerve that comes down underneath that. So do you think somebody with sciatica may have a hip misalignment problem?
Yes.
More than likely, okay? More than likely, okay? The other reason that you're going to get a piriformis syndrome is if some of the bones in the lower back are misaligned, because that also will affect the sciatic nerve. Okay? Let's keep going. All right. Okay, we'll talk about improper footwear. So, high heels, although they are beautiful, aren't. No, I have nothing against high heels. Just get me wrong. Women look beautiful in them. Okay, but here's the problem. You're shifting your weight forward, and you're putting more pressure than normal onto the front parts of your feet, okay? Again, nothing against them, but if you're going to use them, you have to take care of your feet to help them out, right? So we're going to go over some of the exercises and the stretches you can do. Also massage. So if you have a partner, or you don't have a partner, or whatever, you can find somebody to massage your feet. Fantastic for them, okay? The other kind of shoes, like rock climbing shoes or ballet shoes, they force your feet into just abnormal positions that they're not really supposed to be in, which can obviously cause problems over time. That make sense? So people like ballet dancers, rock climbers, these kinds of people, they need to have some sort of regenerative techniques that they can do to help out their feet over time if they're going to be using them. Now let's talk about toxins, okay? So we talked about the blood supply and how the blood actually will regenerate the cartilage in the knees and the tissues, okay? Now, joints need nutrients in the blood to supply to heal them, right? So if we're thinking about like our general, you guys know what this stands for? SAD? The SAD diet, the SAD diet?
Nope.
Stands for Standard American Diet, okay? So these are some of the examples of what's in the Standard American Diet. Processed materials, you're looking at pesticides, you're looking at, what else? Inorganic foods, genetically modified, high trans fat content of the foods. I mean, this is the typical American diet that we see, okay? So unfortunately, if you have that, you have all these toxins that are inside the cells, and if you're trying to regenerate cartilage or regenerate the tissues or heal in any fashion, would it make sense that you'd want to remove as much of those toxins out of your diet as possible? Yeah. So does your diet play a role in people's osteoarthritis? Answer is 100% yes, okay? Because you won't be able to regenerate your tissues if you keep putting toxins into your body, or if you're not getting the proper nutrients. So think about it like this. Let's say we're trying to build a house, okay? We're trying to build a house. If somebody comes along with twigs and sticks and stuff like that and says, okay, go build a house with it that's going to withstand any kind of weather, what would you tell them? Go back to the drawing board, right? Get me some better materials for this house. Does this make sense? So if you're trying to build a body, right, would it make sense that you'd want to use the best materials? Yeah, right, we all know that, right? So you can give the same example of like you're fueling your car, right? You have the different levels of fuel that you could put into those cars there, right? So if you get like a really like awesome car, you got what's a really good car? I mean, got a good car, really good car, high performance, Corvette, right? Whatever, I don't care. But what kind of gas are you going to put into that thing?
Probably premium.
This is the premium, right? The good stuff, okay? You're not going to put the unleaded 87 stuff, right? That's what I put in my Civic, right? All right, cool. All right, now dehydration, right? So let's talk a little bit about dehydration here. So again, if we're talking about blood flow into tissues, if you don't have the proper amount of water, it makes the blood more viscous, okay? Am I saying that right? It's gonna viscous, right? So it's gonna be like, it's not gonna move as well or clumpy. Thicker, right? That makes sense, right? It's gonna be a little bit more thick, right? So if you're trying to get blood into tissues to regenerate cartilage or to feed or anything like that, if you don't have the proper amount of water inside of the body, guess what? They're not going to repair, right? So how much water is needed? Let's just go into that real quick.
A lot.
A lot is a good answer. Speaking of which, water break. Okay, so for every, so what they say is half your body weight in ounces is a good recommendation, okay? And the reason that we give that is because it could vary for like, have you ever heard that whole 8 glasses of water thing that they used to say? Mm-hmm. What if you're 300 pounds? It doesn't, like, you might need a little bit more water, right? So if you're looking at, the average person, right? So if you weigh 100 pounds, 50 ounces is the recommendation. Got it? Make sense? So that's how much you should be drinking. So I fill one of these up in the morning, and I try to get to it at lunchtime to actually fill it up again, but generally I'll end up finishing it by the end of the night, and I'll refill it then and drink more.
How many ounces is that?
This is half a gallon. I used to have that big gallon jug that I'd walk around with this, but it was plastic, and I didn't want to be drinking plastic all day long, so I stopped doing that. All right, let's keep going. All right, we talked about this. Talk about the nerve supply. Okay, so let's get into patellar tracking issues, okay? So another thing with knee issues. So if we're looking here, this is the patella, and then we talked about those muscles that come into the sides, okay? If you have improper balance of your hips, or let's say you have improper nerve supply, or let's just say you're physically inactive, okay? You have these muscles here, and let's say that this muscle here, this is the vastus medialis, or what are called your adductor muscles, or the insides of your leg. If they are not functioning properly, this patella here is going to start to track medially, okay? So it'll start going inward, okay? Same thing can happen laterally. So if these muscles aren't working properly, then this bone will start to track medially, right? It's just because it's whatever muscle's weak, it's going to move away from it, okay? So if it's starting to go medially or laterally every time you take a step, that's going to start to grind on either the inside or the outside parts of your bones, right? That makes sense? So over time, it'll start to wear down, okay? So this is a really easy way to test, like there's simple ways to test it. I'm gonna show you an x-ray. We can actually visualize it on x-ray if this patella is tracking medially or laterally, but there's also orthopedic evaluations that we could do. Pretty simple, right? All we do is we take the patella itself and we pull it either medially or laterally, and as we do that, if there's pain on either the inside or the outside as we do that, it's going to be showing that there's a tracking issue, okay? So that's how we check that, okay? Now here's knee osteoarthritis, okay? So we talked a little bit about this, right? Half the population can have this. Now if we look at this, this is a normal knee. The things that we're looking for is, particularly on this guy when we're talking about osteoarthritis, is these spaces between the bones. So again, this was the femur and this is the tibia. Those spaces should be generally even, right? So roughly even, okay? There should be spaces between the bones. Now, if we look at this is called a narrow joint space, right? So you can see here that the bones are actually starting to get smaller together, okay? We talked about why this happens over time. And then also we can get these little things called bone spurs or calcifications of those joints here. Here, I'm going to just point something out to you. What do you see?
Like a ring.
Here's the cloud, but that's actually the patella, okay? So if you over here, you can see the patella is right in the middle. It's lining up properly. What is this called, guys?
Tracking.
Tracking, right? It's lateral tracking. So it's actually moving out towards the outside, and that's causing problems over time. Because there's obviously there's biomechanical issues that are happening in this knee. Now, one thing I want to point out, a lot of people will say, okay, because this is the one thing that we hear a lot, is that, oh, a lot of doctors will say, oh, I have bone on bone. Have you heard this?
Yes.
Okay, so if somebody comes in and they could actually move their knee, then it's not bone on bone, right? So I've had people come in that have been told that they have bone on bone, which means it won't be able to regenerate. Okay, and then we look at them and we say, oh, your bone can actually move, therefore it's not bone on bone. Okay, make sense? Mm-hmm. Pretty standard stuff, right? So a lot of people have been told that, but it's actually not bone on bone, which means that if it's living tissue, can living tissue regenerate?
Yes.
Answer is yes, right? Have you ever seen, okay, so think of it this way. If somebody, it doesn't matter what age you are, right? If you got a fracture, will the fracture heal? Yes. Mm-hmm. Why does it heal? Because bone is living tissue, right? Replaces itself about every half a year. The bones replace. Yeah.
Wouldn't that just be a simple example of scab?
Yeah, but I give a even more. Some people think of like that's different kind of living tissue. No, your whole body replaces itself. Yeah. Okay, every couple of years, the whole body replaces. That means your bones. That means everything can replace itself. Okay. So when we're looking at this can actually regenerate over time if it's given the right information to it. Okay. We talked a little bit about this. So we talked about flat feet, right? And how if there's improper nerve flow into those legs here, or you're not using your feet properly, those arches that are supposed to be there normally will flatten out. Okay, so we're not going to.
So that's not just an inherited trait.
What?
You're flat-footed.
No. It's usually what it has to do with is, well, okay, think about it this way, right? So we were, over millennia of us being humans.
Yes.
Flat-footed people, if they couldn't run away from the antelope or whatever, or run away from the tiger, would they have survived in the wild? No, right? So that is not an inherited trait, okay? What is inherited, or not really inherited, is lifestyle issues, right? People sitting down all day long, that's inherited, right? That's a trait that people pass on, right? Our family doesn't get up and move very much, right? So we sit down, we don't use our feet properly. That's the problem, right? So we're not. It's not that you're inheriting that's not a genetic issue. Okay. The problem is over time, if you're not using your feet properly, it's going to start to cause those problems. Okay. Bunion formation. Now we're looking at the same kind of thing, right? So if a lot of time when people have flat feet, over time, the bones will actually start to have more pressure on them, and then they start to overdevelop on those areas, right? So we're gonna talk about how to fix this in a little bit, but that's one of the problems that can actually be formed in there. Along with that, another kind of issue that can happen is these hammer toes, right? So where the toes start to cramp up like this. So what I'm gonna show you guys is all different exercises and stretches to actually help all of these things out, right? But do you think it would make sense to have the proper nerve flow going to them? Have the hips aligned, right? Make sure, so we are talking about activity levels, food, right? All these things. So if we're looking at somebody with a bunion, again, do you think it would make sense for us to look at the hips or for us to look at the nerve supply from the lower back that goes into the legs? Yes. All right. So here's one of the things we haven't talked about yet, right? Shin splints. They're supposed to be a normal, I think it's 10, so I wrote it here. So 10 to 1 of the balance from the muscles in the back, supposed to be about 10 times stronger than the ones in the front, okay? What ends up happening is from either overtraining or let's say improper nerve flow or hip misalignments, all these things that we've talked about, the muscles in the back can actually overdevelop, or even sometimes vice versa. What ends up happening is the body will start to lay down these adhesions on the front, and then over time they actually will start to splint, okay? And when they start splinting off the bones, they're called shin splints, right? So that's what happens. Now, we're gonna go over how to fix that. I'll show you in a second. The last one is right here. This is the toenail fungus, right? Now, because the toes are the farthest away from the heart, and they have the worst, a lot of times the worst circulation, right? What ends up happening is things like toenail fungus or all these other types of problems. I'm not gonna go over all of the 18 or 19 of those. But what ends up happening is over time, you're gonna have problems with it, right? So what ends up happening is, let's say the fungus that creates toenail fungus is present on almost every single person, okay? What the issue is if you have improper blood return or blood circulation or unhealthy blood over time, because it's so far away from the area there, it doesn't get oxygenated properly, and then those fungus will be able to overgrow, okay? So it's an environment issue, okay? So it's not necessarily that you know that person was just like inherited toenail fungus, right? It's because their body wasn't able to fight it because it was the blood wasn't healthy. That's how that develops, right? There's some other things like keeping it, keeping your foot in a moist environment for 24 hours a day, right? Things like that, make sure there's proper oxygen. We're gonna go through some of those, but that's how that actually shows up. It's not the person developed, like it's there. Now, like we went over some of the traditional medical approaches and effectivenesses, right? So this is what traditional medicine has, right? They have drugs and surgery. I mean, those are their general tools that they use. Doesn't necessarily address the cause, right? So for pain, cortisone shots or NSAIDs. Now, if you're looking at the root cause, do either of those affect those root causes, like some of the things we talked about today? The actual cause of the problem? No, absolutely they don't. Can they be a temporary like pain relief? Absolutely, 100%. But again, when we're looking at long-term effects, if you take, let's say, cortisone shots, you're not supposed to take more than like 3 of them in a year or something like that. Why do they say that?
Steroid.
Why isn't it good for you though?
Yeah, steroid.
Why isn't it good for you though? Why aren't the steroids good for you? Because they destroy your cartilage. Right? So if you got a problem with your cartilage, let's say your knee, okay, and you go and get this on it, a steroid injection, will the knee have ever a chance to repair itself? It won't, because what it does is it actually, this thing called proteoglycan synthesis, it interrupts it, okay? So it makes it, so proteoglycan synthesis is your body's ability to create cartilage, okay? So if you're taking things like NSAIDs or cortisone shots, what ends up happening is your body cannot regenerate those tissues. And if they can't regenerate the tissues, there's no chance of it healing. That's why it's gonna come back. That's why, so I've had 3 of them, and this one didn't last as long as the last one because your joints are actually getting worse over time. It's not addressing the problem. Surgeries, right? So if we're talking about knee replacements or things like that, on average they last about 15 years. So you get somebody that comes in, we know now that we're living longer, right? We're going to live to about 100 years old. So generally, most of us are. That's just what happens. That's what's happening.
Not going there, bro.
Oh, I'm going there, babe. I'm going 125. Let's do this. So, but here, check this out. So knee replacements last on an average of 15 years. Okay. So if you get one when you're 50 or 60 or something like that, or let's say 45, 50, whatever. 15 years goes by, you need a new one. Okay. I don't know about you, but I don't want to go through a complete knee replacement every 15 years, okay? Now, here's the thing. It doesn't address the cause of the problem, right? Because what's going to end up happening is even if you get that new knee replacement and your hips are still jacked up, guess what? That's going to deteriorate even further, and you can still have pain. Now, 1/3 of the people still exhibit chronic pain after a complete knee replacement. That's terrible. 1 in 5 are dissatisfied with the surgery. So that's the best bet for the knee replacement. Cutting tendons on the plantar fascia, leaving. So we talked about that surgery that I was watching the other day. That thing is nasty. Okay,
Nasty.
let's talk about some solutions, right? So we talked about one of the problems being the nerve flow or the nerve supply that's going down into the lower extremity. So of course, adjustments is a good idea, right? Adjustments and realignment to allow proper biomechanics, proper nerve flow that's going into the lower extremities. So we know that part, real simple. We're gonna go into some pre and post x-rays in a second. Exercises to return normal biomechanics, stress reduction, sleeping. Now why did I put sleep up on here?
That's when your body repairs itself.
That's when your body repairs itself. So 60 to 80% of the healing that takes place in your body happens when you're sleeping, right? So we need that. Maintaining a healthy weight, like we talked about, right? Proper footwear. I'm going to go over some of those things and why I'm wearing these things. Although, aside from them being incredibly attractive. Dietary supplements, essential oils, we're going to go over some of those, and detoxification of the blood, okay? Why would we want to talk about detoxification of the blood? We talked about this for a second. I'm just making sure you're paying attention. Why would we want to detoxify the blood?
The blood goes into your joints.
Yes!
Ligaments.
Thank you. Perfect. Yes, it goes into the tissues. Now here is some problems, right? So we talked about subluxations or misalignments of the joints, right? So this is some of the upper extremity, but let's talk about the lower stuff, right? So this is a picture of the lower back from a side view, okay? So what you want to see is a proper, what's called curve or lordosis in the lumbar spine or the lower back, okay? Because when it's there, you're going to have proper nerve flow coming out of those areas. Now, this is somebody that has what's called a lack of lordosis in their lower back, okay? So with adjustments, traction devices, as well as simple exercises that you can do, we can actually rebuild these curvatures to allow proper nerve flow to go down into the legs. Same thing, pre and post adjustment. So this is somebody who's standing from the front. You can see the spine, how it was shifting out laterally. This is somebody about 9 months later. What do you see?
Getting closer. Getting
closer, right? So we're not getting that major shift there, so the nerves are actually able to flow the way they're supposed to. Okay? Simple stuff, but it takes what's called reconstructive care or reconstructive chiropractic care to be able to do these kinds of things, okay? So if you're on YouTube, find a good reconstructive chiropractor. Soleus Stretch. Okay, so we talked about that pump on the back muscle here. If it's not working, you're not going to get proper blood return from your feet into your knees or into your lower back. So if you think about it, if somebody has a lower back problem, we'd have to make sure where the biomechanics of the legs and the lower extremity are working properly to make sure that their lower back heals. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's why we look at feet. It's very good. So here's some of the things that we do. This is called the Soleus Stretch. So if you look here, and I have a block, well, I'm just going to use the wall here. But if you can look at it, what we do is we put our foot on the block, and then we bend our knee. So I'm going to use this as an example. So foot on the block, and then we bend our knee. I'm just actually going to grab one. Give me a second. Here we go. So this is the foot on the block, right? Let's take a look. You put it down on the floor. You put your foot on it like this, and then you bend your knee here, okay? As you bend the knee, the soleus muscle is actually going to be stretched out, okay? As it stretches out, guess what? It's going to pump properly, right? So every time you take a step, the pump's going to be working. Blood flow is actually going to be able to return to the knees as well as the lower back. This one right here, this is a stretch or an exercise that we use for patellar tracking, okay? So the person will lie on their side. So let's say that patella was tracking out laterally, okay? So if it tracks out laterally, that means that this muscle in the middle isn't strong enough, right? Because that muscle is supposed to keep it this way. And if it's weak, it's like letting the rope go. It's going to go that way, okay? So how do we exercise this muscle here? Like this, right? So we turn on our side, we can get an ankle. There's other ways to do it. You lay on your side, and you literally go like this, okay? Very simple. It's going to start to strengthen. And you don't necessarily need, but what we have here is an ankle weight, okay? So about 10 pounds, something like that, 5 to 10 pounds, or you could do it just against gravity because your leg weighs something, right? So if you're lying down on your side, do it like this. And what's the recommended amount of exercise for this? So I'd say probably like a few minutes or to fatigue, right? So that's a good way to do it. Just go to where you feel it like it's not working anymore, right? So I can't lift it anymore. That's probably a good sign. Do that a couple times, maybe like 3 or 4 times a day, right? It'll start to strengthen those muscles, rebuild it over time, and guess what? Then that knee will start to track properly. The exact same recommendations if it's lateral tracking, or if it's tracking down into the middle or medial tracking, you have to strengthen what's called the adductor muscle, or so the adductor muscles. So these muscles on the outside. Real simple. You lie on your side, you lift your leg up like this. Those muscles start to strengthen up, holds the patella in the proper position, and guess what? You have proper patellar tracking. Isn't that beautiful? I think it's great. What else? Okay, so if we're trying to rebuild cartilage, okay, particularly when we talked about the knee osteoarthritis, when those joint spaces getting smaller, what happens is we need to make sure, so there's some exercises that we can do to actually rebuild those cartilages, okay? So again, with ankle weights, roughly about 10 pounds. We put them on our knees. We find a chair that we can actually dangle from. So I don't have one of those right here, but I'm gonna pretend. So if we're sitting down on it, we have the ankle weights on our legs, right? About 10 pounds. And let's pretend our legs are dangling, okay? So as they dangle, all you do is just dangle it back and forth. And then we're gonna wrap our whole knee with moist heat, okay? So why do we do moist heat?
Helps the joint.
Helps the joint by increasing blood flow and circulation into there, right? Because what the goal is to get blood flow into the tissues and distract it out. So because that's what's ultimately gonna create the tissue, right? Is the blood that's going into there. So if we're distracting it out, right? Real simple, dangling it back and forth. This is called a cross crawl pattern. So that's part of our neurological development. Actually helps healing. So they've done studies where if people just do it on one side, they don't get as much effect as if you just do it on both sides, okay? Because it's stimulating your brain in a way that actually formulates healing and repair. Pretty cool, right? So how long should you do that for? About 5 minutes, maybe a couple of times a day. Now it could take up to 4 years to completely regenerate the cartilage in the knee. Or if we're looking at the hip, we could do it for the hip too, right? So we're trying to open up the hip. So let's say you have a hip that's starting to degenerate, and we know that it can repair. Same thing. This one you probably can't do it on both sides though. You probably just do it on one side, right? But you're opening up and repairing the actual hip itself with these exercises.
Should you do it on both sides if you have only one bad hip?
I would recommend it. Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer, but I don't think it would hurt you to do it on both sides, right? To open up and stimulate those joints. Okay. Cool, right? So again, it could take about up to 4 years to completely regenerate it. But would you? I know obviously that takes a long time, and usually that will relieve a lot of the pain and the pressure that you're having on your knee. So, would you rather have a complete knee replacement, or over time just kind of rebuild it yourself?
People are in a hurry.
yeah, but there's a. So for your feet. We talked about some of the exercises that we want to do to rebuild, to help to strengthen and to help the feet out, right? So to help to rebuild the arches that in the feet that get lost, what ends up happening, there's some simple ones, right? Walking barefoot, 15 to 20 minutes, grass, dirt, or sand. Here's some other things, right? Towel curls. You take a towel, you throw it on the ground, and you literally slowly use your muscles like this, and you start to curl up the towel, right? Same thing, we could do like marble pickups. So you could put a bunch of marbles on the floor, get a cup, take your foot, pick it up, put it there. You ever seen monkeys do this? They're hanging from trees with their feet, right? Pretty strong, right? So we have some of those abilities, right? Some people have more than others, right? Things like ankle alphabet stuff, right? So it's literally just kind of taking your leg, doing the ABCs with it. It's just A, B, C, D. We can all sing the song together. You can help to open up you can open up the lower part of the foot by using a golf ball and stretching it there. Another really good stretch that actually can help the bottoms of your feet too is stretching this, what's called your anterior tibia. So literally just taking your feet and bringing it down. So you can try it out, and literally what you're stretching out is this muscle here. So you're literally just pulling down. A lot of people with plantar fasciitis, this helps them too. So literally you take your feet, pull it forward, and what that's doing is it's stretching this muscle here. So if this muscle also gets tight on people with plantar fasciitis, so if you stretch this muscle out as well, it'll start to allow these things to the plantar fascia to approximate properly, right? And as the plantar fascia approximates, then you don't get the inflammation on it. And a lot of people will feel almost immediate results from that exercise. You could also stretch it just doing like this, or even just sitting on it like this, right? Real simple stuff, but you're stretching out the front part of the muscles, and a lot of people don't actually stretch that part. So that would be a really good exercise for people with plantar fasciitis as well. Okay, proper footwear. So I wear these. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So I use these guys. So when we're talking about like even just with traditional shoes, arch supports and stuff like that, a lot of people will start to, if you're putting arch support inside your foot, you're actually bracing the foot, right? And are you actually allowing the muscles or the intrinsic muscles of the feet to function if you're putting like a brace inside of your foot? No, right? So if you're not allowing the muscles to actually work, what ends up happening is they don't work, right? And then that actually will create a problem. So you're bracing and creating a problem in that sense. So shoes like this, which is as close to nature intended, God made us as possible, are actually the best for us, okay? Because it allows for proper biomechanics of your feet. So when you step, let's say you step with just like your traditional shoe, you go like this, right? This is how your foot moves inside of your foot, right? Or your inside of your shoe. So, and it's kind of like that. You're just kind of like this. When you're walking, you're supposed to have this kind of toe roll. You're supposed to start from the back, and then as you come down, it's supposed to come from the outside and then go into the middle. So for the people on the camera there, outside to in, like this. So if you're walking, that's the actual step that you're supposed to take. So when you're walking with your traditional shoes, you really can't get that kind of motion because it doesn't allow it, okay? So proper biomechanics of feet. They have the whole movements now where the people are actually using these kind of shoes to run marathons and all these things barefoot, like it's the minimalist movement, okay? So these kind of shoes are gonna be fantastic for you. Get them on sale if you can.
What's the brand of
This is called Vibram, right? These are the ones I like the best. Vibrams. What to eat? So we talked about it. So I try to imagine, just try to get as close to natural as possible. If you look up things like the Mediterranean diet or paleo, and then when you look at the foods, make sure they're organic. You're gonna be eating right. Okay, Mediterranean diet, paleo. Make sure you're drinking plenty of water. Bone broth and collagen. These are the things that actually go to formulate and like we're talking about building blocks of the cartilage. Bone broth, collagen. Those are your building blocks of your actual joints themselves. And so particularly for people with plantar fasciitis, anti-inflammatory diets are really fantastic because it reduces the amount of inflammation. And I'll let you know, Mediterranean diet is an anti-inflammatory diet. Healthy gut support, right? So if you want to make sure you're getting plenty of probiotic foods, including things, so we talk about probiotic foods. Kefir, what do we got? We got a lot of good ones.
Kimchi.
Yogurt, kimchi, thank you. There's lots. I mean, you could just look it up. Okay, we got plenty of probiotic-rich foods. Your fermented veggies, right? Kombucha, fermented vegetables, fermented fruits. Yeah, that's what we're looking for as far as probiotic-rich foods. Apple cider vinegar is another source of really good foods, which is good for both anti-inflammation and probiotic-rich, right? Dark chocolate, I just put that in there because everybody likes dark chocolate. I love dark chocolate. Juicing, cleanse the blood, right? So things like just your traditional vegetable juices, get plenty of that inside of your diet. It's fantastic for it. Some simple supplements that people could take. Chondroitin, right? Chondroitin sulfate, glucosamine, high hyaluronic acid supplements. You could do turmeric, garlic for anti-inflammation. So these three here particularly refer to rebuild cartilage or rebuild joints, right? So chondroitin, glucosamine, high hyaluronic acid, those are good joint stimulating or joint supports. Turmeric and garlic are fantastic for anti-inflammation, as well as like a pure form omega oil, which is just like a vegan type of oil. So it's like a good omega oil. Bentonite clay on feet for detoxification, also really good for people with athlete's foot. On top of that, I'm going to show you some oils for athlete's foot in a second. Okay? Got that? Here's some essential oils. They're fantastic for both anti-inflammation as well as we're looking at athlete's foot. These are fantastic for it. So things like oregano, tea tree, cinnamon oil for athlete's foot. How do you do it? You get what's called a carrier oil. So like a coconut oil, so like certain companies, like we use doTERRA in our office, you get that, they have a carrier coconut oil. You mix in these different oils with it, the oregano, the tea tree, the cinnamon, rub it on your feet. It usually gets rid of the athlete's foot pretty quickly. There's also just good things like for anti-inflammation too, okay? What else? That is pretty much all for tonight. So yeah, we do for anybody that's watching this online or anybody that is curious about it, we offer free initial consultations to come in to just talk to us.